What's up, gangsters? How about episode 8 of the Brough Superior adventure? But before I get into it, I don't even actually know when I'm going to publish this one. It kind of depends on how quickly I move through my next steps. But before I even get to any of that, I'm going to do something that I rarely do, which is address in sort of real time, because this was from just a few days ago, a comment from one of these videos. And you guys know, if you've ever watched much of my stuff, I don't really treat YouTube as a social media platform. If you've ever asked me a question that I didn't answer for like a year or ever, you know that. But I think this one is pretty relevant. There's a guy who's mentioned a couple of times that if you really just want a Brough Superior miniature on your shelf, why don't you just go buy a die-cast one? And he's not wrong. They are available. I think the only one I've seen is the one from Mini Champs. It's 1/12 scale, so it's smaller, and it's nice. But it's, I mean, you know, you see prices range from $300 to, I saw a dude trying to get one sold on eBay for over $1,000, you know. And look, they're not bad. But the thing about those is, well, there's two things. One is that if all you want is to have a little bitty Brough on your shelf, then yeah, that's a good way to go. But that's not the only thing I want. The other thing is that they, you know, die-cast collectibles, no matter how good they are, always have a certain toy-like quality about them because of the way that they have to be produced. It's frankly the only way that they can produce those things at any sort of cost that would be affordable to a normal buyer. I mean, there are, you know, really high-end die-cast car model companies that, you know, sell amazing stuff for like 10 grand, 15 grand, 20 grand. But if you're going to sell something for a few $100, you have to be able to take advantage of economy of scale. And so it's going to have a certain, you know, certain amount of the blob factor. And so this gets into a question of value. I'm an engineer, not an economist, but I love the concept of the value proposition. And I think that this is sort of a good moment to just waffle for a second about how, you know, what the value proposition is for any of us who do scale modeling. Because you see, you know, different statements about what that is or what that should be. I mean, you know, there's always that one guy, more than one, unfortunately, in a Facebook scale modeling group who says, well, actually, the real purpose of a scale model is to be an accurate representation in miniature of the real thing. Okay, that's a cool story, bro. We're happy that you have it so well defined for you. And that's the only person that you can define the value of something like that for, is for yourself. It's really all about what you value. And anybody who's watched nothing but these videos might think that I'm doing this just because I want a Brough on my shelf. I've said repeatedly that I think it's one of the most beautiful things ever, and that I love the whole story with, you know, in spite of the tragedy with T.E. Lawrence. But that's not the only reason I'm doing it. I love to build miniatures, and I love a certain amount of realism. And so neither of those things are going to happen if I just go buy one, right, off the shelf. So that has zero value for me. The other thing that I really like, if you've watched any of my other videos, you may have picked up on the fact that something else that I find value in is building something unique. I try to make every one of my scale models my own. I like the idea, you know, as narcissistic as it may be. I like the idea that I built the only one like it in the entire universe. And if you buy one off the shelf, you're going to have one exactly like everybody else who bought one off the shelf. And if you build a model kit straight out of the box, you're going to have a model kit that's pretty much like everybody else who did the same thing has got. And so that's why I've, taken the time to do my own research and to find a representation of the brough that appeals to me personally on an emotional level, beyond just building the representation that the instructions would have you build. That's why I've designed my own chain. That's why I've designed my own primary cover, and why I will probably end up designing a few more parts before this ridiculousness comes to a conclusion, because that's what I value. And so that's, as usual, a really long answer to a pretty simple question. But for the guy who's mentioned that several times, yeah, you're not wrong. But it's wrong for me. I don't want to do that. That's not where I find value. That's not that's not gonna represent the value proposition for me. And so I will continue to soldier on with this thing until I get to the end, because it is the only way that I will realize my personal value proposition. So, with all that waffling done, let's get into whatever is happening now. Okay, since we're talking about things that I value, well, realism is certainly one of them, although what's actually realistic is a whole other conversation that, we ain't got time for on this episode. But I started putting together these bits, and this was a good example of why I'm really trying to use solder as much as possible on these. So I put these two halves together. You can see that they are two halves because of how poorly they line up, and I soldered them. And then I soldered the entire thing to this chunk of the engine by just wicking as much in there as possible. And it plugs into the side of the cases. Yeah, maybe. It plugs into the side of the cases like that, and it fits pretty well. But this piece right here, I'm not even sure what it is, but it drops into that little horseshoe-shaped recess, and I couldn't really solder that, so I used some black CA, and I wicked a bunch of it in there, and that all looked pretty good. And that was yesterday, like 24 hours ago. And I sat down, started working on it, and fussing with filing off the molding line on that side, and discovered that this was still loose because the super glue had not totally set. And that is one of the issues with this rubberized, whatever the heck that even means, super glue, high impact rubber toughened formula. I don't even know how actual rubber and cyanoacrylate can go together. Who knows? I think it's just marketing nonsense. But anyway, this stuff does take a long time to cure, and I thought 24 hours would be plenty, but apparently not. So I had to clean all that off, and I'm going to have to re-glue that on there. But again, that's just, I just generally despise super glue. When it works great, it works great. The rest of the time, it's a complete pain in the ass. The other thing about this is that in looking at pictures of the real thing, I don't like the bolts around the perimeter. These are really just soft and small, and I'm going to remove those, drill out some holes, and replace them with separate hardware that I know will look much better. Possibly the same thing with the oil line fittings. You can see one right there sticking out of the bottom of that thing, and there's a couple of them sticking out of here. I don't know. They're not terrible, but yeah, we'll see. Anyway, so that's that. Now, they're on the other end of this thing are supposed to be a couple of chromed parts, like so. And when I look at reference photos, that's fine. I mean, it doesn't, yeah, there it goes. That's fine. Looks pretty cool. But the Brough Superior in the Imperial War Museum that was owned by T.E. Lawrence is the only one in photos that I see where these two parts are in fact chrome. And in the rest of my reference photos, they are black and they are shaped differently. And I don't know if they're metal or possibly some kind of phenolic. I don't know, but they're black and they look different. And I think I'm probably going to do that. Probably going to design and 3D print those and use them there instead. All right, so there's all that. Now, the other thing that I have been working towards is attaching the rear fender temporarily, and that's how that looks. Pretty good. But here's a good example of the kind of little battles that you just fight every step of the way with this thing. That pin right there where it goes in, you can see it has a little bracket molded on the bottom of it there. Not even close to lining up with the top surface of the fender. So I probably will be able to just, I don't know, twist it around to get it to work. But it is what it is. And keeping the fender in the right spot, it's really tempting to just go ahead and solder this fender in there now. But that's obviously going to make it difficult to really paint it nicely. I don't know. We'll see. I may give in. Yeah, we'll see. Because it's hard to get it in the middle of the swing arm in the first place, much less keep it there. And if I put it in there after it's all painted, you know, I'm going to have to put it in there, put the screw in, put some glue on it. I don't know. We'll see. Don't like it. But before I do that, I want to figure out if the rear wheel and tire combo is going to still be able to go in here with this little tail of the fender down there. And in order to do that, I first need to get this wheel fixed. Here's a good look at just how dinked up it is. Yeah, see that? Yeah, you can see it. It is very much crooked with respect to the sprocket side, not as crooked with respect to the brake side, which is concerning because that suggests that the faces of the hub are not parallel where those respective pieces glue on there. And when you look at it from the top, it's kind of the same situation. So yeah, there's going to have to be some investigation. And I'm not going to do like I did on the previous ones where I can make, you know, ask you to suffer through every step of me fixing this. I'm just going to spend however much time and effort is necessary to fix it and then come back and tell you later what I did. Well, the nonsense continues. As I said I was going to do, I knocked off these bolt heads that I didn't like and drilled them back out exactly where they were. And then I got out my stash of hardware, and I've got these beautiful aluminum turned flange bolts that I think I might use to replace the previous bolt heads. And I thought I picked a size that I liked, but when I put them in there, they were just too small. And so then when I looked at the next bigger size, The holes were, as I was afraid of, too close to the edge for that tiny, beautiful little bolt head. So, which I just now dropped and lost. Yeah, anyway, sometimes you got to sacrifice things for the YouTubes. Anyway, so no big deal. This is one of the things that I love about this soldering technique. I just filled those in and I'll file them down and re-drill and it'll all be fine. No big deal. And here things are a couple of weeks later. Yeah, I did not work on the wheel because what I did decide to do was go all the way through to near completion with this subassembly that I talked about before. And I'm pretty happy with it. I think it turned out pretty good. And so let me see if I can just step through all of the things. So what had to happen first was to deal with the finish on the metal parts that were going to be seen. You'll see this aluminum cover. And this, by the way, is the ignition coil and the magneto. Distributor, etc. And this gizmo sticking out here is the oil pump. So, in various photos, you'll see this aluminum cover polished out to various degrees of shininess. And I could have done that, but I decided that I liked this look better. I sanded it down to 1,000 grit with started with my motorized wheels on my Proxxon, and then switched over to Infinity sanding sponges. And I really like this look, partly because I think it just looks, you know, it's just kind of satin and it looks more like aluminum wood, but also it provides some contrast to this other part, which I did try to sand and polish because the real thing actually, I mean, in some cases anyway, it looks more like this, but it's just hard to get into all the places. The good news is that on pretty much every reference photo I have of the real thing, this casting has a lot of flaws in it. You'll see it with pits and chunks taken out of it. So anyway, I feel like it doesn't look too bad and it's pretty realistic. So let's go through all the things. Somehow I managed to turn this from about 6 parts into about 36 parts. And as mentioned, where I started was with the 3D printed things because I wanted to replace these fasteners right here in the sheet metal cover, and so those are my 3D printed dome head screws. I really like the way they come out. My little Mars 4 Ultra has 18 micron pixels, and that's what you need for stuff like those slots. I think I ended up making those 0.25 millimeters wide, and I got them to print pretty well. The other fasteners that I printed were, well, actually, that's it. I also printed, like it's kind of a fastener, a fitting. The if it'll focus, the compression fitting on that bottom oil line that attaches to the cases right here. This one right here. And I did that because in the process of doing all the sanding, I just knocked the one that was molded in off, and it didn't look great anyway. So printed and painted, and it's pretty much the new one is indistinguishable from the ones that are molded in up there on the oil pump. I also printed this little brass adjuster wheel, which I guess is some kind of a manual flow rate adjustment, and it does not want to focus, but you can see that brass knob. And on some bikes the knob was brass, others it was just I guess, raw steel, and on others it was chrome plated. And I thought, well, the brass one gives a little bit of contrast and looks pretty cool. I also printed a couple of different versions of the lid for the top of the pump, because what I really wanted was what I did here. And that was to have separate metal fasteners, because I've got these lovely little hobby design rivets that have a 0.5 millimeter head and a 0.35 millimeter shaft. And I thought, well, I will just print the lid with holes, and I'll just put those in, and they'll be too long, but I'll just clip them off. Yeah, so that's how the plans of Mice and Men gang after glay. The universe cares not for our puny human plans, nor does 3D printing. And I quickly discovered that I was not going to be able to print this with the holes. And this is a good moment to just talk about 3D printing capabilities. So it's pretty much a given that everything you print with a resin printer is going to be between 0.1 and 0.2 millimeters oversized because of bloom. And that's where basically you get overcure. The pixel mask may be exact for the slice that's being printed, but the UV energy from the light will bleed through the resin because it's not perfectly opaque. And so you're going to get a little bit of, you could call it overspray. I've got other videos in my 3D printing adventure playlist that talk about that. But the bottom line is, it's always going to be a little bit oversized. And that means holes are going to be a little bit undersized. And so you're not going to get away with printing a hole that's accurate, until you start to get above a couple of millimeters. Because that 0.1 millimeter, let's say, of overcure is going to be a constant. And so as a percentage of hole size, it's going to be increasingly large as the hole becomes decreasingly small. And so, if you've got a 1 millimeter hole, you've got a 10% undersize. And if you're trying to do a 0.4 millimeter hole, like I was in the corners of this lid, you got like a 25% undersize. And in fact, they usually are going to just fill in completely. But it's a good idea to still go ahead and put them in the CAD model, because you'll get a divot that you can use that's kind of serves as, what would be a center punch for your drill. And especially when you need 4 of them to be perfectly positioned near the edges of that little piece, it's a good idea to have that divot to guide the tip of the drill. So that's what I had to do there, was just drill those out. And I was successful at doing that. But I also printed a version that included the fasteners, just in case I was not able to get all of that to work. But I didn't really want to try to paint those and make them look good. So yeah, this is where I discovered that these little fasteners, and this includes the fasteners, the flange head bolts that are in the cases there, are not aluminum. As I said previously, I think they may be stainless steel because they are very hard. And I discovered that the first time that I drilled one of these little pieces out and put one of those tiny rivets in there, actually put all 4 of them in there, and it was not easy. Getting those things to fall into the hole it took me like 40 tries to get 4 of them in there, and I lost a few. And as soon as I went to try and clip them off, it just busted the corner completely off of that and basically barely bent the little rivet, because even with some Xuron clippers, these things just did not clip that easily. They're pretty hard. So what I ended up doing was, and this is why you print multiples, like 3 or 4 of these things, because I needed another one. I needed to drill out another one. And what I ended up doing was clipping these off at what as close as I could tell was the 0.5 millimeter length that I needed, which made them like the size of fleas and very easy to lose. So what I would do is I would clip them with the head facing down into a paper towel to catch them, and also with the white background make it relatively easy to see. And then very carefully I would use my super pointy Annie's tweezers to pick them up and position them in the hole. But it was really difficult, and my attrition rate was something like 50%. But I finally got them done, finally got them glued in there with some extra thin CA. It was a lot easier to do it with everything still attached to the supports, drilling, placing the screws, and wicking some CA underneath. It was really kind of brutal. It took me like 3 hours to finally get a lid that I liked and get it glued on here and have it sort of come out the way that I wanted it to. And I think it was worth it because the shiny heads, shiny dome-shaped heads of the little, and they're called rivets, but I want them to represent like Phillips head screws. They ended up looking pretty good. So yeah, it was a struggle, but worth it. This is a good time to point out that another reason to print multiples is because of an issue that a number of us have discovered, and we were actually talking about this in my little 3D printing and Fusion 360 user group a couple of days ago, are these random bubbles that you sometimes get in the top of a part like that where you have a flat surface. Nobody has figured out why they happen. You can see it right there between those two studs. They're randomly positioned. Like you can see, there are none in any of these flat rectangular lids, but in 2 out of the 3 coil covers, there was a bubble, and fortunately there was one perfect. So, you know, it is what it is. It's always good when you're printing little bitty parts like this to print multiples, because you're going to break some, you're going to lose some, or you're going to have defects like that. The other thing to point out is that back to the drilling or the pilot hole thing, I knew that I was going to be plugging some wires into what's basically the intersection of those 2 different sized cylinders. And so I made a hole there as I showed in the CAD model, and that gave me enough of a pilot to get my 0.3 millimeter bit, actually 0.4 millimeter bit in the right spot, and to clean those out, drilled them out by hand, and that worked out pretty good. So that's got all the printed parts, and those ended up being the, like I said, the coil cover and the ignition, or the distributor, the magneto cover, whatever you're going to call that. Because what happens is, and this is a good place to point out in the instructions where things are a bit vague and possibly incorrect. They show the ignition wires as those 2 yellow things coming out there, but they don't really do it. It's not right. Every reference photo that I've seen actually shows the ignition wires coming out, or the spark plug wires rather, coming out of this molded feature right here. There's one on each side of the magneto right there. And so what I'm going to end up doing is drilling a hole in the back of this, of the magneto, just right in there, where I can just blind plug in a couple of leads that'll end up being the ignition wires. So there's that. And this is just a 0.5 millimeter lead wire that I plugged in there, and that worked out pretty good. Not 0.5, that's not right. Anyway, it's a little smaller than that. Anyway, bottom line is lead wire works great for that kind of thing. Got them plugged in there and nicely shaped and then painted, and I think they look pretty good. That silver arm sticking out there is a photo etch part from the kit, and it has a hole in the end of it, and I used one of the one of my smaller Top Studio flange bolts, which is not really accurate, but it looks good. And this goes back to one of my values, which is sometimes that I prefer visual interest over absolute accuracy, like these wires. I don't know if they even had colored wires in 1930, but it provides a little bit of color, and that draws your eye to the detail in that area, and I like that. This magneto cover I printed with a little pocket there for those wires to plug into, and that all went together pretty cleanly. All right, now, so then as far as the oil lines coming out of the front and the bottom of the oil pump, that's 0.5 millimeter nickel silver rod, which is nice because it forms pretty easily, and you can get these nice clean curves by using a pair of beading pliers that are made for that. And I've got a pair, whoops, wrong pair, hold on. They look like this, and you can see the round jaws help you make a nice smooth radius when you're bending a piece of relatively stiff wire. You don't need it for stuff like lead wire because it's easy to just sort of tease that into shape. And what I like to do with the lead wire is plug in one end of it and glue it, and then just kind of tease it into shape using toothpicks or whatever's necessary. Anyway, the oil lines are another issue with the instructions, because you can see that I've got the one that comes out underneath plugging directly into the side of the cases, and then the one that comes out the front is routed underneath, and then I've got it just popping out right there. And that is because the instructions, I feel, are wrong. They may reflect the bike that's in the Imperial War Museum, but they don't reflect any of my other reference photos. You can see that they've got the line coming out from underneath the oil pump going to this cast piece that goes across, and then section 9 shows that going to, let's see here, this is one of the things with the instructions, you gotta jump around, probably to, yeah, from the oil tank, yeah, right there. And then you've got this thing, you've got this brack cord, that's just so funny, coming out of the back there. And I think that actually is not a hose, but rather it's the cable that goes to the handlebars for priming. Okay, now the other thing that you've got for oil lines is there's supposed to be one between the cylinders, and I'm not sure, they may not even include that, and I think that that's the discrepancy. I don't see it. Yeah, see, they don't even have it. It should be on the back of the base of the front cylinder. And what I see in reference photos, leads me to believe that the way that I've got this plumbed is correct. And that what actually happens is that the oil line that routes around and underneath the this whole subassembly pops up, goes across the top of the engine cases, sometimes underneath the engine cases, but it plugs into the oil tank. That it's basically the return line, the supply line from the oil tank, or maybe it's, I don't know, it's either the return or the supply. I think it's the return. And it should plug into the oil tank. In other words, there should be two inlets into this oil tank, because that one that they show as going to section 5 and routing back to the bottom of the cases is the one that actually should plug in to the base of the front cylinder. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because it's a complete loop where you've got oil coming from the oil tank into the cylinder, flowing into the cases, coming out of the cases, getting drawn into the pump right here, and getting propelled out of the front of the pump through this line that runs around up to the oil tank as the return line. And so what I'll do is, once I get it all figured out, how this is gonna, everything's gonna fit, I will add a second piece to that line right there. I'll just plug onto that and have it run across the fuselage, the frame, to this side of the oil tank, and plug into a fitting that I will add there. So I think that'll take care of that discrepancy. Now, the other thing that they don't include in the instructions is that the magneto has a manual control on the handlebars that allows you to either retard or advance the ignition timing. Yeah, I did say retard. It's a thing. Don't get mad. Anyway, so I made a little 3D printed boot. It's hard to see, but it's inside there. And it's attached to a little stub of lead wire plugged into a hole that I drilled in the magneto case. And I've got a piece of nickel silver tubing plugged into the top of it, so that I can plug a piece of wire into that, and then have a piece of tubing going over that to represent the cable that runs up through the frame, underneath the gas tank, and up to the handlebars. So anyway, I think that covers all the things that I did. It's a lot of stuff. It was a lot of work, but I'm pretty pleased with the way it turned out, and it feels good to actually kind of get something done, feel some sense of accomplishment, and kind of, feel like, okay, I've got part of this at least that's going to look like the end thing, and that's helping me keep the end goal in mind when this thing gets really frustrating. Here's another look at these parts inside of Fusion. You can see that I just made an assembly with each part just kind of suspended out in space, and you can get a little bit better look at what some of those look like. One thing I tried to do was get the serrations on the edge of this little adjuster knob, but that's just outside of the resolution capability of even my super duper little Mars 4 Ultra. This part right here at the bottom, that is a spacer that I made to go between the springs and the frame that I had talked about. And you can see a couple of other things. This is one that I don't think gets mentioned in the video. This right here is the adjuster screw that's in the side of the oil pump. Okay, well, hopefully that wasn't too bad. As usual, a bit long and exhausting detail about the details. But I feel like it also kind of works because of that whole waffle at the beginning about how we value our time and effort as model makers. This really was all about that. Completing this little bit, this little sub-assembly is a reflection of what I value in terms of realism and visual interest. So in specific terms, it's definitely about that. But also a little bit more philosophically, because as I said, I really got to where I felt like I needed to just make some progress, to finish something, to see something at least pretty close to the way that it's going to look at the end of the project. And that's a reflection of not only, what's important to me in terms of just finishing a project, but that a big part of how I stay motivated is by having a vision of that final finished thing. And in the case of building a model airplane, it's always pretty easy to do, because I usually have a vision of what the completed thing is going to look like before I ever even order the kit or certainly open the box. And that comes from looking at a lot of reference photos, and also because, going back to the whole uniqueness thing, I almost am always only going to build a model airplane that I feel like is a bit unique. Like you guys know, if you've watched any of my other stuff, I pretty much never go off the color callouts. I'm working on my own color scheme or whatever. And so it's easy to identify at the beginning what the finished product is going to look like. And that's and therefore it's easy for me to keep that in mind all the way through. And I can't overemphasize how important that is to keeping me motivated. I see guys, ask occasionally, like, I've lost my mojo. How do you keep your mojo? Look, trust me, it's a struggle sometimes. And this project in particular is a good example of that, because I know what a brough Superior SS100 looks like. I think it's beautiful, and I can see a picture of it in my head. But the truth is they all kind of look the same, especially if you're not going to put any weathering on them. And so for me, this thing has just not had that sort of creative vision that I can hold as a goal to keep me going. And it's been tough. There's been some places where I frankly just wanted to swipe the whole thing off the workbench into the trash can, regardless of how much it cost. And I'm glad I didn't give in to that, because now that I've gotten a little bit of it that's that close to completion, it kind of really brought the flavor back for me, and that's good, because I think that's going to help me get through whatever is left to do to get to the point where this frame and everything actually is ready for paint. Oh, dear Lord. I can't. It's been like 3 months since I said I thought I was about ready to do that, and still not. So, and still some significant work to do. And when I think about how much work there is between here and the finished product, it's a lot of stuff. But hopefully I will be able to hold on and see it through to the end, and hopefully I can make some good content, and you guys will be able to suffer through to the end. But at any rate, if you've watched this much of it, as always, it's much appreciated and much love.